left, it contains a bunch of different sounds, even in Live Lite, this limited version. We have two instruments. One is called Simpler, which is a sampler, which is an instrument that samples audio. And the other one is called Impulse, which is generally used for lots of percussion sounds. We can search by the instrument. Impulse has a bunch of different presets. Simpler does as well, as you can see, and they're in different categories. Or if we just dig through the instrument rack folder, this has all of the instruments combined. So how do we load up a sound? Let's find one we like first. Let's start with a very simple keyboard sound. This one's fine. I'm going to click and drag this sound onto one of our MIDI tracks. So let's drag it onto track 1. Now to be able to play this sound, we need to arm that track, which is this little button here. If it's red, we're good to go. And let's say you don't have a controller or a keyboard or anything. If we click this button in the top right here, this will actually turn our computer keyboard into a playable piano keyboard, quote unquote. So I can use home row here. And there's even accidentals. And you actually have access to the whole keyboard, and you can change octaves with Z and X. And if you have zero gear, no controller at all, it's not a bad way to actually play in some notes. But I do have a controller here in front of me. I have a very basic keyboard called the Roly Lumi. It's basically just got 24 keys on it. It's very portable. And the reason I chose this for this course today is because you will see the notes illuminate. So I feel like that's really easy to follow along with. So regardless of what kind of keyboard, or if you don't even have a keyboard, you can still follow along with the notes. And we'll get into talking more about notes in a minute. Now, one way for us to get started making some music is to first come up with a chord progression. And to do that, we need to understand a little bit about music theory. So for the purposes of this course, for the beginners out there, we're gonna only be working in the key of C today. Essentially meaning we're only going to use the white keys on the keyboard. I know this keyboard's a bit of a rainbow, but we're not going to use any of these upper keys, which would normally be the black keys on a keyboard. And a very basic way of thinking about chords is it's got to be at least 3 notes. And if we're in the key of C, if we evenly space our fingers out, and we basically just skip a note, 1, skip 1, 1, skip 1, we have the most basic chord type called a triad. 3 notes, right? And we can do that anywhere on the keyboard. 1, skip 1, skip 1. Let's go somewhere else. 1, skip 1, skip 1. And that works for us working in the key of C major. We can pretty much put our hand anywhere and play a triad. But as you get more advanced, you'll start to learn how to play in other keys, so I think it's worth explaining how this works. So there are 7 notes in a scale. And I say 7 because that 8th note right there is actually C, and so is this. So there are 7 unique notes in the scale, right? And that goes for any scale, whether we start on C or we don't start on C. What makes a certain combination of notes work in this way is the distance they are between each other. And for the purposes of understanding this, we're going to pretend that all these keys are equal. So even though these keys are smaller and pushed up to the top, we're going to actually count them as equals. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we're going to call the distance between these 2 keys a half step because there's no key in between them. We're going to call the distance between these 2 keys a whole step. And that's the same throughout the keyboard. Don't get confused because E right here, there's no notes in between E and F. Just because there's not a black key here doesn't mean that this is a whole step. this is still a half step. The relationship between these notes is a half step. Just like the relationship between these notes is a half step. If there's nothing in between, it is a half step. If there's one note in between, it's a whole step. So again, B to C, there's no notes in between. We only take one step to get there. It's a half step. If we have to take 2 steps to get there, the distance between these notes is a whole step. So if we understand that very basic concept of whole steps and half steps, we can now build a scale because there's a set pattern for scales. And let's talk about the major scale, a happy one, which I already played for you. We're probably so used to hearing that. And it's built on the pattern of whole steps and half steps, a specific pattern of whole steps and half steps. We have whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. If we understand that pattern of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, we can play a major scale starting on any note, not just C. Say we wanted to play a D major scale. We can't just start on D and play the white keys. That doesn't sound right. So let's use the pattern that we just learned. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Whole step, another whole step, which that's a half, that's a whole, which remember, we're going to treat all notes equally. So this is a whole step, and this is a whole step. 1, 2. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And suddenly we have a familiar sound again. That is a major scale, but starting on a different note. Understanding that fundamental concept of the distance between notes being whole steps and half steps is what can actually help us understand a chord progression when we're starting to build one. The reason this C major chord sounds happy is because the distance between these 2 notes is what we'll call a major third. If I changed this note to an E flat, we suddenly have a sad sounding chord. And just by changing one note, because the distance between the 2 notes has changed. If that sounds like a lot, that's okay, because like I said before, we are going to stay in the key of C, only using white keys today. I just wanted to explain that concept of the distance between notes and the relationship between notes having an effect on the sound, and hopefully build a solid foundation for when you're ready to move on to more advanced concepts. So just keep that information on the back of your mind, and let's start building a chord progression. So the simplest method that I mentioned before was evenly spacing your fingers on the keyboard. So let's record a very simple chord progression. First, we have to decide on the chords we're going to play. I might start on A and play A, C, E, which is a minor chord, A minor. Then I might play F, A, C. I might start by playing A minor, followed by E minor, followed by F, followed by D minor. And I'm just doing that all by keeping my fingers evenly spaced. And I want to record that and loop it. So let's figure out how to do that within Ableton Live. So a very important first step is we have to set our tempo. And that tempo is represented by this number in the top left, 120, which if we turn our metronome on, which is going to be like our click track, and we press play on the project, we'll start to hear that. Now this is a pretty fast tempo. So if I play that chord progression, It's not really too fast, but we could get a little slower and maybe be a little bit moodier with our track, I suppose. So we do that by clicking on that 120 and dragging down. You can also change this number by clicking on the tempo number and typing. Could go 80 BPM. Let's go 82. Now pressing play again or spacebar, we'll now hear our new tempo. And you can hear a higher pitched click and a lower pitched click. 1, 2. That higher pitched click is our downbeat. And that's our 1. And we only have to count in increments of 4. So let's count along with the metronome. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're just going to keep counting in cycles like that, always having that high-pitched note of the metronome being our downbeat or the 1. If we understand this, we can start creating loops in Ableton Live. So what I'll do is I'll record that chord progression, and I'll hold every chord for 4 beats, just like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we'll record that as a loop. So we'll have 4 chords, each held for 4 beats each. And to start the recording process, what we have here in Ableton Live's session view are a bunch of different clip slots. Each of these little rectangles represents a different musical idea, or it can hold a different loop on a different instrument. You'll notice that there are circles on this track versus the squares over here. That's because this track is armed for recording. We can play it. If this next track was armed for recording, these would turn to circles because we can record into these slots, and record is represented by a circle. So let's start by recording a musical idea into an empty clip slot by pressing this record button. Now, in preferences, we set the record count in to be 1 bar, which means it's going to give us a count in of 4. It's going to count to 4, and then it's going to start recording. It won't start recording as soon as we click the record button. So try to follow along, and let's record our chord progression into this empty clip slot. I'm going to press this play button, and suddenly we have a loop. Now that last step there, I did have to press what now turned into a play button to loop it back around. And the way that works is through a big fancy word called Ableton Live's global launch quantization, meaning that the second I hit record or the second I hit play, it doesn't instantly stop or instantly play. It plays or starts recording or starts looping on the next downbeat. Remember that higher pitched tone in the metronome, that downbeat, the 1? Everything will sync up to that, so we can never fall out of sync. This helps us keep even, and that's why it's important for us to choose our tempo and be playing along to a metronome. So now we can create a nice even loop, be it a simple one at that. So now we have our very easy chord progression loop here. And you know, we're not drum machines, we're not robots, so sometimes when we play, things can get a little off the grid here. So let's zoom in a bit, and you can see I was not perfectly on, boom, that downbeat. So what I can do is quantize. And if I select all the notes, I can either highlight them all, or I can press Command or Control A for Windows users. I can go ahead and hit Command U or Control U, and it will snap everything to that grid, which is very, very useful. Let's take a look at this grid and these numbers here for a moment as well, just so we can understand. Remember, we were counting to 4. We were counting along with the metronome. Let's go ahead and turn the metronome back on. 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice that these 1, 2, 3, 4, these beats are labeled 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, and they're also labeled by their bar number. So this group of 4 right here is bar 1. So this is bar 1, beat 2, bar 1, beat 3, bar 1, beat 4, hence the 1.4. As we move on through the progression, we can see that we have a 4-bar progression here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the beats are labeled accordingly. 4.2, 4.3, 4.4. With this downbeat here being the 1, of course. So there we have a very, very simple chord progression and a simple loop that we can start building our track on. Now, I chose these chords, these triads, arbitrarily. As you start messing around with your keyboard, you can go ahead and choose different chord progressions. What's going to sound the best at this stage, at the beginner stage, is staying in one key, which is why playing with all white keys in the key of C works best, especially for beginners. So as long as you have your fingers evenly spaced, you'll have pretty decent sounding chords. So come up with the combination that you like the best and build your own 4-chord loop just like this. Once you have your 4-bar loop recorded like I do, we can actually change the sound a bit. And most of Ableton Live's preset sounds come with 8 macro knobs here that we can adjust. So things like reverb. We can add some reverb in, which I really like. Tremolo, let's hear what that sounds like. Adds a little shake to the sound. Brightness. And suddenly we have a new sound different from the actual preset that we started using. I want to talk about attack and release really quick because it's important going forward, because many sounds you can adjust the attack and release. The attack is the initial hit of the sound. If I bring that all the way down, we'll have a very clear attack. If I bring it all the way up, we'll have almost a faded in kind of sound. Release, on the other hand, affects the end of the sound. So release effects, if I crank that up, the sound will drift off for longer when I release the key. If I bring that release all the way down, as soon as I lift off the key, the sound will stop. We barely even get a sound with release all the way turned down. Let's bring it up to 46. And then again, turned all the way up. And having a high release time might work well for the chords in this instance. I like it. And as we work through with different instruments in Ableton Live Lite, take a look at some of the macros and adjust the sound so it's closer to your liking. So that was how to build a chord progression in Ableton Live Lite. Let's go ahead and move on and start building a beat with some drum samples.